Hi there, I'm Dr. Ahles. In this video, we're going to talk about the endocrine system, and in particular, we're going to talk about the ways that hormones travel through the body based on their solubility. Before we dive into that complex idea, let's start with a review of how the endocrine system works. When we talk about the endocrine system, we're talking about the system that your body uses to send hormones throughout your bloodstream. So different cells throughout your body, often grouped together in organs, like your anterior and posterior pituitary glands or your pancreas, have cells inside of them that secrete particular hormones or particular messages. Those messages get into the bloodstream, travel throughout the bloodstream, and leave the bloodstream at various places. If they find a cell that is their target cell, that hormone that's been released will cause a change in that target cell. So as we're thinking about hormones that are made in the body, a couple of important things to keep in mind from the top. Thing number one, we have what are called the secreting cells or the source cells. And thing number two, we've got the target cells, the cells that need to get these messages. That's our first idea, those cell types. But the second idea is what we're going to be focusing on a little bit more here in this video, is the idea that hormones have to travel through the body in blood vessels to get to the places that they need to go. When we think about traveling through the body, recognize that we're using your bloodstream to do that. And plasma is made of a lot of water. It's primarily a watery substance. Some of the messages that we're sending in your body, in particular types of hormones that we call proteins or a special kind of amino acid called a biogenic amine, these are what we would call water-soluble. And when you're thinking about things that are water-soluble, think about you in a bathtub or you in a swimming pool. You have the ability to be in there, you can move around inside that water. When we're thinking about water-soluble hormones, they don't care that the body is made of so much water. They can float through the water in that bloodstream, no help required. But some of the hormones that we use in the body are what we call lipid-soluble. So in particular, we're talking about things like the steroid hormones that are made from cholesterol or the thyroid hormones. When we say they're lipid-soluble, this means that they do better when they're surrounded by fats, by lipids. Except remember that bloodstream is full of water. So when we're thinking about a lipid-soluble hormone, this is going to be a type of hormone that needs some kind of carrier protein, or in my instance over here, some kind of boat to make its way through the water. So first thing we need to know about our hormones, are they water-soluble or are they lipid-soluble? That's going to give you an idea of how they move through the body. If we know how they move through the body, that's going to help us predict several different things about them. So let's start with those lipid-soluble hormones, the hormones that needed that boat or needed that help to travel throughout the bloodstream. When we look at the way that lipid-soluble hormones are released, they can actually go straight through the plasma membrane of the cell that makes them to go out into the body. This is because the plasma membrane is actually made out of lipids, these things called phospholipids. So when a cell builds a lipid-soluble hormone, naturally that hormone is going to leave the cell and enter the bloodstream. But the bloodstream, remember, is filled with watery plasma. Because of that, my hormones that are lipid-soluble that enter the bloodstream attach to carrier proteins. Those are proteins that essentially protect the parts of that hormone that don't like to be next to water, will cover it up, act like that boat to transport it through the body. When my lipid-soluble hormones get throughout the body to the place that we would find a target cell, at that point, we're going to release that hormone from its transport protein to interact with the target cell. Now, a really important difference between a lipid-soluble hormone and a water-soluble hormone is the location of the receptor for a lipid-soluble hormone. When we talk about the receptors, the parts that are actually going to hear this lipid-soluble hormone message, these receptors are going to be found inside the target cells. So whether that receptor is somewhere inside the cytoplasm or often somewhere inside the nucleus of the cell, that target cell will wait until that receptor goes through its membrane, through its cytoplasm, to that receptor where it's going to hear that message. And when we think about what lipid-soluble hormones do in a cell, their job is to change gene expression. When we think about the actual effects of gene expression, what we're really talking about is building proteins. So a lipid-soluble hormone will travel through the bloodstream attached to a transport protein. It'll go into its target cell, into the nucleus, where it attaches to a receptor. That receptor says, let's turn on this gene, or let's turn off this gene, ultimately leading to the synthesis of a new protein. This is how it works when I'm lipid soluble, when I need help to travel throughout the bloodstream. But let's go back to that other kind of hormones that we also have in the body, and those are the water-soluble hormones. Now, when we think about water-soluble hormones, these don't have the ability to pass straight through the plasma membrane of the cell. When we think about releasing these, we have to use a process called exocytosis. In exocytosis, a cell essentially makes a bubble filled with these hormones, and then it spits those hormones out. Now remember, these are water-soluble hormones, so when they get into the bloodstream, they say, hey, there's water out here. I like water. They don't need any help to transport throughout the body. So water-soluble hormones do not use a carrier protein to travel throughout the bloodstream. Another critical difference between water-soluble hormones and lipid-soluble hormones is the fact that water-soluble hormones attach to receptors that are on the surface of their target cells. Remember when we talked about the lipid-soluble hormones, that they went straight from the blood vessel into the cell where they found their receptors? Well, water-soluble hormones can't get across that plasma membrane. So the way that they're going to get their message in is by attaching to a receptor that's found in the surface of that cell. That receptor becomes activated and ultimately leads to a series of different chemical events that happen inside the cell. So we go through something that's called a signaling cascade. When the receptor gets activated, it activates another protein, which activates another protein, and will go all throughout the cytoplasm and change what's going on with proteins that are out there. But at the same time, we're not only changing what's happening outside of the nucleus, we will ultimately make changes inside the nucleus as well. If we look more up close at that receptor, we have a water-soluble hormone that attaches to it. It activates a special kind of protein called a G protein. That G protein travels along the cell's surface and activates another kind of protein called adenylate cyclase. Ultimately, that's going to lead to the activation of a kind of protein called a kinase. I don't need you to know all of these specific proteins. I don't need you to know that the receptor talks to a G protein and adenylate cyclase. I don't need you to know all that. But what I do need you to know is that my water-soluble hormone stays outside of the cell that it's having an effect on. It has to have an impact inside that cell though, and it's going to do that using all of these different proteins that we see here. We would call these secondary messengers, or this cascade of proteins that all work together to generate a response. That response, by the way, is way louder than the response that would have been triggered by a hormone by itself. So when I attach a water-soluble hormone to a receptor, that's going to activate 1 or 2 or 3 G proteins. And those G proteins are going to activate several different adenylate cyclase proteins. And each of those adenylate cyclase will activate more kinases. What ends up happening is one message has a very, very large impact inside the cell because we've amplified it using all of those different secondary messengers that were inside the cytoplasm of the cell. So let's take it back big picture. What we were talking about in this video is the difference between a lipid-soluble hormone and a water-soluble hormone. Way number one that they're different is how they travel through the body. A lipid-soluble hormone is going to need some kind of carrier protein to protect it from the water in your bloodstream. A water-soluble hormone loves water. It needs no help to travel through the bloodstream. Second way they're different is where we find the receptors for them. Because a lipid-soluble hormone can go straight through the plasma membrane of a cell, the receptors for it are going to be found either in the cytoplasm of the cell or even inside that nucleus. That's different when we're talking about the water-soluble hormones. Remember that those can't get inside the cell, so they're going to attach to a receptor on the surface of the cell. Then they're going to use a series of secondary messengers to activate various proteins, both in the cytoplasm and also inside the nucleus. That brings us to the third important difference about these hormones, and it's what their effects can be. When we think about a water-soluble hormone, not only can it do the typical change in gene regulation, so we're going to make more of a protein or less of a protein. Because it uses all of these secondary messengers, it can also have impacts in the cytoplasm of the cell. So it can change proteins that were already present, activate them, or deactivate them. It can lead to two different kinds of effects. When we think about lipid-soluble hormones, there's only one kind of effect that they can have, and that effect is changing the activity of your cells. As you're reviewing and starting to learn specific different hormones, keep these ideas in mind. How do they change the cell? What kind of changes do they do? With those ideas in mind, you'll be well set up to understand the way that things work.